The fluorescent lights of Riverside Children's Hospital hummed softly as Director Margaret Chen sat in her office on the 5th floor, reviewing the quarterly financial reports. Outside her window, the Chicago skyline stretched endlessly under a gray November sky, threatening snow. It was 7:30 p.m., and most of the administrative staff had already gone home, leaving the building in that peculiar quiet that hospitals have after dark, not silent, but muted, punctuated only by distant beeps and the occasional shuffle of footsteps. Margaret rubbed her tired eyes and reached for her 3rd cup of coffee that evening. The hospital was facing another challenging year. Despite their best efforts, funding was always tight, and the pediatric oncology wing desperately needed new equipment. She was deep in thought about potential donors when her assistant director, James Whitmore, knocked on her open door. "Margaret, do you have a minute?" James asked, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "Of course, come in." She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen something troubling." James sat down, holding a manila folder. "I was doing routine payroll audits today, and I found something unusual. It's about Robert Martinez, one of our night janitors." Margaret frowned slightly. She knew Robert by sight, a quiet man in his late 50s who had worked at Riverside for nearly 12 years, always punctual, always thorough, always wearing that same gentle smile. "What about him? Is there a problem?" "Not exactly a problem," James said carefully, opening the folder. "But I noticed something in his payment records. For the past 8 years, he's been voluntarily having half of his paycheck redirected somewhere. I thought maybe it was a garnishment or something legal, so I looked into it further." Margaret leaned forward, her interest piqued. "And?" "It's going directly to our hospital's Children's Cancer Care Fund, half of every paycheck, every 2 weeks for 8 years. James paused, letting the information sink in. "Margaret, Robert makes $32,000 a year. He's been donating $16,000 annually to help pay for treatments for kids whose families can't afford them." The words hung in the air between them. Margaret felt something catch in her throat. "That can't be right. Check it again." "I already did, 3 times. James slid the papers across the desk. "It's all here. Direct deposit splits. Half to his personal account, half to the fund. The accounting department confirmed it. They assumed it was some kind of arrangement you knew about." Margaret stared at the documents, her hands trembling slightly as she picked them up. The numbers were clear, undeniable. For 8 years, while she and the board had been organizing galas and courting wealthy donors, one of their lowest-paid employees had been quietly giving away half of everything he earned. "Does he have family?" Margaret asked quietly. "A daughter, Maria. She's 26, works as a teacher's aide in the public school system. His wife passed away about 9 years ago. Breast cancer. 9 years." The timeline aligned perfectly. Margaret's mind raced. "James, do we know why? Has he ever mentioned this to anyone?" "That's just it. He hasn't. I asked around discreetly. Nobody knows. He never talks about it. Just comes in, does his job, and goes home." James shook his head in wonder. "The finance team only flagged it because I was doing deep audits for the annual review." Margaret stood and walked to her window, looking out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the early evening darkness. Somewhere out there, families were struggling with impossible choices. Terrified parents sitting beside hospital beds, praying for miracles they couldn't afford. And here, in this building, a man who could barely afford his own modest life was giving half of it away. "We need to talk to him," Margaret said finally. "I thought you might say that. He comes in at 10 p.m. for the night shift." James checked his watch. "That's in about 2 hours." Margaret nodded, still processing. "Don't tell him we're coming. I want to understand this better first. Pull his employment file, everything. And James, not a word to anyone else yet. This is his story to tell, not ours." After James left, Margaret sat alone in her office, the financial reports forgotten. She thought about the countless meetings she'd attended, the speeches she'd given about compassion and care, the mission statements and values plastered on the hospital walls, and all along, the truest embodiment of those values had been quietly mopping floors in the middle of the night. She pulled up Robert's employee file on her computer. The photo showed a kind face, weathered but warm, with deep laugh lines around brown eyes. His performance reviews were consistently excellent, reliable, thorough, respectful. One supervisor had noted, "Robert always takes extra care in the oncology wing. The children love when he waves to them through the windows." Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from her husband. "Working late again." She responded quickly, "Something important came up. I'll explain later." How could she explain this? She barely understood it herself. At 9:45 p.m., Margaret stood from her desk and straightened her blazer. She caught her reflection in the dark window, a successful woman in her late 40s, well-dressed, well-educated, well-compensated, and she was about to meet a man who had more generosity in his worn work boots than she'd ever managed in her designer heels. The thought made her humble and ashamed and inspired all at once. She took the elevator down to the ground floor, her heart beating faster than it should. The hospital at night was a different world, quieter, dimmer, with only essential lights burning. She found James waiting by the janitorial supply room. "He just clocked in," James whispered. "He's starting his rounds on the 3rd floor." They took the stairs up, and Margaret's mind whirled with questions she wasn't sure she had the right to ask. What would she even say? "Why are you giving away money you desperately need?" It seemed invasive, inappropriate, but she needed to know. The hospital needed to know. Maybe the world needed to know. They found Robert on the 3rd floor, pushing his cleaning cart down the pediatric corridor. He was humming softly to himself. She recognized the tune as "You Are My Sunshine." Through the window of one room, a bald little girl, no more than 6, waved at him. He stopped, waved back, and made a funny face that earned him a giggle before continuing on. "Robert," Margaret called out softly. He turned, surprised to see the director and assistant director at this hour. "Ms. Chen, Mr. Whitmore, is everything okay?" His accent carried the gentle rhythm of someone who'd learned English as a second language, but had spoken it for decades. "Everything's fine," Margaret assured him, though her voice wavered slightly. "I was wondering if we could talk to you for a few minutes. Privately?" Concern flickered across Robert's face. "Am I in trouble?" No, nothing like that," James interjected. "We just have some questions about your payroll." Understanding dawned in Robert's eyes, followed quickly by something that looked like embarrassment. He glanced down at his cart, his calloused hands gripping the handle. "Oh, you found out about that. Can we go somewhere to talk?" Margaret asked gently. Robert nodded slowly and led them to a small staff break room at the end of the hall. The room was modest. A few chairs, a coffee maker, a bulletin board covered with schedule notes and thank you cards from patients' families. Robert gestured for them to sit, but remained standing himself, looking uncomfortable. "Robert, please sit," Margaret said. "You're not in any kind of trouble. We discovered that you've been donating half of your salary to the Children's Cancer Care Fund for 8 years. Robert sat down heavily, his eyes focused on his hands. "I was hoping nobody would notice." "Why?" The question escaped Margaret before she could stop it. "Why would you hope that?" Robert was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands clasped together on the small break-room table. Outside the window, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, catching the amber glow of the parking lot lights. Margaret and James waited, not wanting to push, giving him the space to find his words. "My wife, Carmen," Robert finally began, his voice soft but steady. "She died 9 years ago. Breast cancer, stage 4 by the time we caught it." He looked up at them, his brown eyes reflecting old pain that had never quite healed. "We had insurance through my job here, but it didn't cover everything. The co-pays, the experimental treatments, the medications, they added up so fast." Margaret felt her chest tighten. She knew this story too well. She'd seen it play out hundreds of times in her years at Riverside. "We tried everything," Robert continued. "I took extra shifts wherever I could find them. My daughter Maria, she was just starting college, but she dropped out to work and help with the bills. We sold our car, then borrowed against the house. Carmen," she kept apologizing, like getting sick was her fault. His voice cracked slightly. "She would cry at night when she thought I was asleep, saying she was ruining us." James shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Margaret realized she was holding her breath. "In the end, we couldn't afford the treatment she needed. The doctor said there was this new immunotherapy. It might have given her more time, maybe even saved her, but insurance called it experimental. It cost $60,000 for the course of treatment." Robert's jaw tightened. "We didn't have $60,000. We didn't have $6,000. We had debt and hope, and neither one was enough." The break room was silent, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the corner. Through the walls, they could hear the distant sound of a monitor beeping, the murmur of nurses making their rounds. "Carmen died on a Tuesday morning," Robert said quietly. "February 19th, 2016. The sun was shining. She always loved sunny days. She held my hand and Maria's hand, and she told us she was sorry. Sorry for leaving, sorry for the debt, sorry for everything." He paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. I told her I'd give anything to have more time with her, but anything wasn't enough when we didn't have the money." Margaret felt tears welling up in her own eyes. She'd been a hospital director for 15 years, and she'd learned to maintain professional distance, to not let every tragic story break her heart. But something about Robert's quiet dignity, his matter-of-fact telling of an unbearable loss, cut through all her defenses. "After she passed, I was angry," Robert admitted. "Angry at the insurance companies, angry at the system, angry at God. My daughter and we were drowning in medical debt. I took every extra shift I could, but it felt pointless. Carmen was gone, and we were left with bills that reminded us every month of what we'd lost." He stood and walked to the window, watching the snow fall. "Then, about 6 months after Carmen died, I was working the night shift here in the oncology wing. It was quiet, about 2 a.m. I was mopping the floors outside the patient rooms, and I heard crying. Quiet crying, like someone trying not to be heard." Robert turned back to face them. "I looked through the window of room 347, and I saw a man sitting beside a little boy's bed. The boy was asleep, bald from chemo, maybe 7 years old. The man was just sitting there in the dark, his head in his hands, crying. I kept mopping, tried to give him privacy, but when I moved past the door, he looked up and saw me. We made eye contact, and I saw it. That same look Carmen had. That desperate, defeated look when you know you need to do something, but you can't." Margaret found herself leaning forward, completely absorbed in the story. "The man came out into the hall," Robert continued. "He looked embarrassed that I'd seen him crying, but I could tell he needed to talk to someone. He asked if I worked here, and when I said yes, he just started talking. His name was David, and his son Jackson had leukemia. They'd maxed out their insurance, exhausted their savings, and they needed to get Jackson into a clinical trial at another hospital, but they couldn't afford the travel and accommodation costs. He said he felt like he was failing his son." Robert's voice grew stronger, more purposeful. "I stood there in that hallway, listening to David tell the same story I'd lived with Carmen, and something broke open inside me, or maybe something finally made sense. I couldn't save my wife. I couldn't turn back time and somehow find the money we needed. But I was standing in front of a father who was exactly where I'd been, and I realized maybe I could do something. That night, I went home, and I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about David and Jackson, about Carmen, about all the families in this hospital fighting battles they couldn't afford to fight. When morning came, I called the finance department and asked about the Children's Cancer Care Fund. I'd seen it mentioned on paychecks but never paid attention. They explained how it worked, donations directly from employees to help cover costs for families who couldn't pay." Robert sat back down, his hands steady now on the table. "I thought about my salary. After taxes and deductions, I take home about $2,400 a month. My mortgage is paid off. Carmen and I bought our house in 1989 for $40,000, and we finished paying it off 5 years before she died. My daughter had moved out. I didn't need much. Food, utilities, a little for gas and maintenance on my old truck. He looked directly at Margaret. I realized I could live on $1,200 a month if I was careful. It wouldn't be comfortable, but I could do it. And the other $1,200, that could be 5, 6, 7 kids a year who get the treatment they need. Maybe more. James let out a breath he'd been holding. So you just started doing it? I set it up that week, Robert confirmed. Half my paycheck, every paycheck, straight to the fund. I didn't tell anyone because I didn't want it to be a thing. I didn't want people feeling sorry for me or thinking I was some kind of hero. I'm not. I'm just a man who couldn't save his wife, trying to make sure other people can save their children. Margaret's throat felt tight. Robert, do you have any idea how much you've donated? I don't keep track, he said simply. It's not about the number. It's $128,000, James said quietly. Over 8 years, you've donated $128,000. Robert's eyes widened slightly. It was clear he'd never done the math. He sat back in his chair, looking stunned. That's a lot of kids. At least 50 families, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. Maybe more, depending on what they needed. Robert, you've changed lives. You've saved lives. Robert shook his head. The doctors saved lives. I just pushed a mop and signed a paper. No, Margaret said firmly, standing up. She walked around the table and sat in the chair next to Robert, looking at him directly. You made a choice every single day for 8 years to put other people's children before your own comfort. That's not just pushing a mop. That's heroism. Robert looked uncomfortable with the praise. I just did what I could with what I had. Carmen always said that life is about helping people. She was a nurse before she got sick. She spent her whole life taking care of others. When she died, I felt like I'd lost my purpose. This gave me a purpose again. Did you ever find out what happened to Jackson? James asked. The little boy whose father you met that night? A smile broke across Robert's face. The first real smile since the conversation had started. He's in remission. 14 years old now. Plays baseball. David sends me a Christmas card every year. He doesn't know about the donations. He just knows I was kind to him that night, and he's never forgotten it. There are probably dozens of families like that, Margaret said. Families you helped who will never know your name. That's fine with me, Robert said. I don't need to be thanked. I just needed to do something that mattered. When you lose someone the way I lost Carmen, you realize how short life is, how quickly it can all be taken away. I couldn't stand the thought of just going through the motions, collecting my paycheck, and going home to an empty house. This made the work mean something. Margaret stood, her mind racing with ideas, with possibilities, with the weight of what she'd just learned. Robert, can I ask you something? If people knew what you were doing, if we shared your story, more people might be inspired to help. The hospital could use your example to raise awareness about the fund. Robert stood too, his expression uncertain. I don't want attention, Ms. Chen. I really don't. I understand, Margaret said gently, and we won't do anything without your permission. But think about it. Your story could inspire others to give what they can, whatever they can afford. Even small donations add up. Your example could create a ripple effect that helps even more children. Robert was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. Let me think about it. Can I have a few days? Of course, Margaret assured him. Take all the time you need. They stood to leave, but Robert called out, Ms. Chen, Mr. Whitmore, thank you for not making this weird. I was worried you'd try to stop me, or tell me I needed the money more than the kids do. Margaret turned back, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Robert, what you're doing is the most remarkable thing I've encountered in my entire career. I wouldn't dream of stopping you. I just wish we had 100 more people like you. As they walked back to the elevator, James whispered, What are you thinking? Margaret looked back at the hallway where Robert had returned to his cart, resuming his quiet work. "I'm thinking that tomorrow I'm calling an emergency board meeting. I'm thinking that this hospital has been searching for inspiration, for a reminder of why we do this work. And we've had it all along, mopping our floors. I'm thinking that Robert Martinez deserves more than our gratitude. He deserves to be celebrated. And if he doesn't want the attention?" Margaret smiled, a plan forming in her mind. "Then we'll find a way to honor him that respects his wishes, while still sharing the message that matters. Because this isn't just about Robert. It's about reminding everyone, staff, donors, families, that making a difference doesn't require wealth or power. It requires heart. And that man has more heart than anyone I've ever met." The board meeting 3 days later was unlike any Margaret had ever called. She'd invited not just the trustees and major donors, but department heads, senior staff, and representatives from the finance and human resources departments. The conference room on the 6th floor was packed, the Chicago winter sun streaming through the tall windows. Margaret stood at the head of the table, Robert's employee file and the donation records in front of her. She'd spent the past 72 hours thinking about how to approach this, how to honor Robert's story while respecting his desire for privacy, how to channel the emotion she felt into something actionable. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," Margaret began. "I've called this meeting because 3 days ago I learned something that fundamentally changed my perspective on this institution and what we're capable of achieving." The room fell silent, all eyes on her. "For 8 years, one of our employees has been donating half of his annual salary to our Children's Cancer Care Fund. Not a wealthy donor, not someone seeking recognition or a tax benefit. A night janitor who makes $32,000 a year and has been giving away $16,000 of it to help families afford treatment for their children." The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Board Chairman Richard Bloom leaned forward. "Margaret, that's extraordinary. Who is this person?" "His name is Robert Martinez," Margaret said. "And before I go any further, I need to tell you that he's asked not to be publicly identified. He doesn't want recognition. He just wants to keep doing his work and helping these families. So what I'm about to share with you stays in this room. Understood?" Everyone nodded, the atmosphere in the room shifting to something almost reverent. Margaret told Robert's story. About Carmen, about the treatments they couldn't afford, about the night he met David in the hallway, about the quiet decision to give half of everything he earned to ensure other families didn't face the same impossible choices. She shared the numbers, $128,000 over 8 years, at least 50 families directly helped, countless children receiving treatment they otherwise couldn't have afforded. When she finished, several people were wiping their eyes. Dr. Patricia Williams, the head of pediatric oncology, spoke first. "I've been working in this field for 30 years. I've met philanthropists who write million-dollar checks, and I'm grateful for them. But this is the most profound act of giving I've ever heard of. He's giving from his own need, not from his excess." "Exactly," Margaret said. "And that's why I've called you all here. Robert's story is a mirror that reflects back to us what we claim to be about: compassion, sacrifice, putting patients first. But it also raises a question. If a man making $32,000 a year can find a way to give half of it to help sick children, what can we do?" Richard Bloom nodded slowly. "What do you have in mind?" Margaret had prepared for this. She clicked a button on her laptop and a presentation appeared on the screen behind her. "I'm proposing the Hearts Like Robert initiative. It's a 3-part program." She advanced to the first slide. Part 1, we create a matching program for employee donations. Any Riverside employee who chooses to donate to the Children's Cancer Care Fund will have their donation matched dollar for dollar by a special fund we'll establish. This incentivizes giving and multiplies the impact. Part 2, she continued, moving to the next slide. We launch an external campaign called Whatever You Can. We share the essence of Robert's story without using his name to show people that meaningful giving isn't about the size of the donation. It's about the intention. Whether someone gives $5 or $5,000, it matters. We stop making people feel like their contribution isn't enough. Dr. Williams raised her hand. How do we fund the matching program without compromising patient care? I'm glad you asked, Margaret said. Which brings me to part 3. I'm personally contributing $100,000 to seed the matching fund. And I'm challenging everyone in this room to contribute what they can, not what they think they should give, but what genuinely feels meaningful to them. The room was quiet. Then Richard Bloom spoke. Margaret, that's an incredibly generous personal contribution. It's not nearly as generous as what Robert has done, Margaret said quietly. He's giving from what he needs to survive. I'm giving from what I can spare without changing my lifestyle at all. There's a difference. Board member Sandra Martinez, no relation to Robert, though the shared surname felt oddly appropriate, stood up. I'd like to contribute $50,000 to the matching fund. And I'd like to propose that we look at employee compensation across the board. If we have people working here who are earning so little that donating half their salary still seems feasible to them, we need to address that. Agreed, said Richard. Let's form a committee to review wages, starting with our support staff. Margaret, proceed with your initiative. You have the board's full support. Over the next week, the response was overwhelming. The matching fund grew to $300,000. Staff members at every level began signing up for automatic donations. Some gave $5 per paycheck, others gave $50. The finance department reported that participation in the Children's Cancer Care Fund increased by 230% in just 1 week. But what moved Margaret most happened on a Thursday evening when she stayed late to finalize the external campaign materials. She was walking past the 3rd-floor pediatric wing when she heard voices in the family waiting room. Curious, she paused outside the open door. Inside, she saw Robert sitting with a young couple. The woman was crying quietly, and the man looked exhausted, worn down by fear and stress. Robert was speaking softly. I know it feels impossible right now. I know you feel like you're drowning and nobody understands. But you're not alone. This hospital, these people, they care. And your son is strong. You're all strong. The man said something Margaret couldn't quite hear, and Robert replied, I lost my wife to cancer 9 years ago. I understand what it feels like when you can't afford to fight it the way you want to fight it. But you keep fighting anyway. You fight with everything you have, and you accept help from people who want to give it. That's not weakness. That's courage. Margaret quietly stepped away, not wanting to intrude on the intimate moment. But she understood something new about Robert in that moment. The donations weren't his only gift to these families. His presence, his empathy, his willingness to sit with parents in their darkest moments and say, I understand. That was equally valuable. 2 weeks later, Margaret made a decision. She knocked on Robert's maintenance closet door during his shift. He opened it, looking surprised to see her again. Robert, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Okay, he said cautiously. We're launching the campaign publicly next month. We're not using your name, and we've been careful to keep your identity private, just as you requested. But I've been thinking there's another way you could help these families, not with money, with your presence. Robert frowned, confused. What do you mean? I mean, would you consider being a volunteer patient advocate? Formally, we could reassign some of your janitorial duties and have you spend part of your time with families who are going through what you went through, just talking to them, being there, offering the kind of understanding that only someone who's walked that path can offer. Robert's eyes widened. I don't have any training for that. I'm not a counselor or a social worker. No, Margaret agreed, but you have something more valuable, lived experience and genuine compassion. We'd provide support training, of course. You'd work with our social work team. But Robert, I've seen you with families. I've seen how you connect with them. You could make such a difference." Robert was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Would I still mop floors?" The question surprised Margaret. "If you want to, yes. But why would you want to keep doing that if you could do this?" "Because mopping floors is part of the job," Robert said simply. "It's how I started helping people here, and it keeps me humble. I don't ever want to forget that every job in this hospital matters. From the doctors saving lives in surgery to the person making sure the floors are clean and safe. Carmen taught me that everyone's work has dignity if they do it with care." Margaret felt that familiar tightness in her throat again. "Then you'll do both. You'll be our patient advocate janitor, the first one in the hospital's history." Robert smiled. "Can I think about it?" "Of course. But Robert, I hope you say yes, because you're already doing it informally, and I think making it official would help even more families find you when they need someone who understands." 3 days later, Robert agreed. The hospital created a new hybrid position for him, paying him $10,000 more per year, which Margaret noted he would probably try to donate, but at least it would help his own finances as well. He would spend 4 hours of each shift as a patient advocate and 4 hours maintaining the pediatric wing. The Whatever You Can campaign launched in March. The marketing materials featured a simple message. One person giving half of everything they had helped 50 families find hope. What can you give? Within 3 months, the Children's Cancer Care Fund received donations from over 1,500 new contributors. The smallest donation was $3 from a 10-year-old girl who sent her allowance. The largest was $500,000 from a tech entrepreneur who'd been moved by the campaign. But the most meaningful impact happened in the quiet moments that couldn't be measured in dollars. Robert sat with dozens of families that spring, listening to their fears, sharing his own story, helping them navigate the impossible emotional landscape of having a child with cancer. He became a fixture in the pediatric oncology wing, not as an anonymous janitor, but as Robert, the man who understood. One afternoon in May, Margaret was doing rounds when she saw Robert sitting in the family lounge with David, the same David whose son Jackson's illness had inspired Robert's original donation 8 years earlier. Jackson, now 14 and cancer-free, sat between them, showing Robert pictures on his phone of his baseball team. "This is Tyler," Jackson said, pointing to one of his teammates. "His mom has cancer. He's been really sad lately, and I told him about you, about how you helped my dad when I was sick. Would you talk to him sometime?" Robert looked at the photo of a young boy in a baseball uniform, and Margaret saw something shift in his expression. "Of course I will. Have your mom give him my number at the hospital. I'm here whenever he needs to talk." David put his hand on Robert's shoulder. "You know, 8 years ago, you probably don't remember this, but you told me something that got me through the hardest night of my life. You said, the only thing stronger than fear is love, and you love your son enough to find a way through this." "I've never forgotten that." Robert looked surprised. "I said that." "You did, and you were right. We found a way through." David looked at his healthy son. "Partly because of the fund that helped us get Jackson into that clinical trial. I found out later that a hospital employee was donating their own salary to that fund. I've always wondered who it was, so I could thank them." Margaret watched Robert's face carefully. He smiled but said nothing, just patted David's hand. "Whoever they are, I'm sure they'd just be happy that Jackson is okay." After David and Jackson left, Margaret approached Robert. "You didn't tell him?" "No," Robert said simply. "He doesn't need to know. He just needs to know that somebody cared enough to help. That's what matters." "But what about you?" Margaret asked. "Don't you need to know that your sacrifice made this possible?" Robert looked at her with those kind, weathered eyes. "Ms. Chen, every time I see a child like Jackson healthy and playing baseball, every time I sit with a scared parent and they leave feeling a little less alone, every time a family tells me they received help from the fund, I know my sacrifice mattered. I don't need them to know it was me. I just need to know that love is stronger than fear, that giving is more powerful than keeping, and that my Carmen would be proud of how I'm living without her." Margaret nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When she finally found her voice, she said, "She would be incredibly proud, and so am I. You've changed this hospital, Robert. You've changed how we think about giving, about service, about what really matters." "I just did what I could with what I had," Robert said, echoing what he'd told her that first night. "That's all any of us can do." That evening, as Margaret drove home through Chicago's bustling streets, she thought about Robert's words. She passed expensive restaurants and luxury car dealerships, billboards advertising products nobody needed, people rushing from one transaction to the next. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise and commerce and consumption, a man who cleaned floors for a living was teaching everyone around him what wealth really meant. It wasn't about how much you accumulated, it was about how much you were willing to give. The following month, Riverside Children's Hospital received its largest donation in history, $2 million from an anonymous donor. The accompanying note said simply, "Inspired by Robert, inspired to be better." Margaret kept the note in her desk drawer. She never found out who sent it, but she didn't need to. The ripple effect of one man's quiet generosity had become a wave, lifting families and children who would never know his name, but would forever benefit from his heart. Robert continued working his hybrid position, mopping floors and healing hearts, never seeking recognition, never expecting praise, just showing up every night and doing what he believed Carmen would have wanted him to do: help people. And in hospital rooms throughout Chicago, families facing their darkest moments found hope not just in medical treatments and generous donations, but in the simple presence of a humble man who'd walked through their same valley of shadows and emerged on the other side with compassion intact. He wasn't a doctor or a millionaire or a celebrity. He was a janitor who understood that the most profound gift we can give each other is not money, but the willingness to sacrifice our own comfort to ease someone else's pain. The hospital never officially revealed Robert's identity to the public, honoring his request for privacy. But among the staff and families at Riverside, his story spread like a quiet legend. The night janitor who gave half of everything to help children he'd never meet, whose love for his late wife transformed into love for countless families who needed it. And on quiet nights, when the hospital settled into its after-hours rhythm, you could still find Robert pushing his cart through the pediatric wing, humming softly to himself, waving to children through windows, stopping to talk with worried parents, making sure the floors were clean and the hearts were full, because that's what heroes do, not for recognition, not for reward, but simply because someone needs to, and they're willing to be that someone.